Hi everyone, my name is Moshmi. I'm a consultant on gender and racial change and anti-racism for schools and corporates. I got sent the Lindsay Dentlinger video and a number of my friends asked for my views on it. So I thought I'd do hopefully a quick video to explain my views, because I think that this video offers us a great opportunity to reframe the paradigms through which we talk about race in this country in a way that would actually result in behavioural and hopefully systematic change. So let me talk about the problems I have with how race is framed in South Africa. Firstly, we tend to talk about race or racism or racial prejudices as if they are some kind of outlying unusual behaviour, that they're an individual moral failing. And effectively, when we're looking for racial prejudices or racists, or there's an incident, we look for a very narrow range of things. So we're looking for a bad individual, an unusual bad egg who holds prejudicial beliefs on a conscious level. And I'll tell you my problem with that definition is that it really ignores that racism is systemic. And there's no country in the world, I think, in which racism is more a systemic issue and is more endemic than South Africa. I mean, national amnesia is almost like a national sport. And we tend to ignore the fact that we're a mere 20 odd years out of a white supremacist system of statehood, where people were treated differently according to their race, made to live separately. And this state machinery was very sophisticated at propaganda and messaging. And people who lived through it will tend to forget or pretend to forget the kind of messaging that they were getting. I think the primary messaging around it is you remember the Red Scare, the Communist Scare, and die Swartgevaar, or the fear of black people. And that being a reason why so many of the behaviors of the previous government were justified. But there was a consistent messaging towards people of different races about black people, about their abilities educationally, and about their violence, etc., which justified the way that their state behaved. And we certainly have not gotten rid of that. There's been no means of readjusting our behaviors. So pretend that they don't exist is probably why you get so much anger when a racial incident happens, is that effectively black people in South Africa are being gaslit on a national level to pretend that racism is something that every one of us is not impacted by, and that we don't all hold racially prejudicial views on the basis of the brainwashing that we received during apartheid. It's frankly quite bonkers that we're still treating racism in such a narrow way, and that we're still pretending that you have to be an especially egregious individual to display racially biased behaviors. So my first step would be, we need to reimagine the way we look at race so that people have space to own their racial prejudices. So I hate to say this, but if you have grown up in South Africa, even if you're a born free, you have grown up in a situation of systemic racism, and you hold certain prejudicial beliefs, whether consciously or not, as a result thereof. So I want to talk a little bit about this issue of whether it's conscious or not. And I know that I feel like, particularly for someone doing this kind of work, that the word unconscious bias has almost become a dirty word. And I understand that, because it seems like a cop-out. It seems like avoiding the word racism, based on that narrow definition that racism must be an active belief, right? And that we're trying to avoid culpability for that. Also based on a narrow belief that you need to be a bad person who's punished if you have racial biases, rather than, hey, you're South African, you have racial biases, acknowledge them and work on them. So let's talk very briefly about the neuroscience behind how racial biases develop, or any kind of bias develops. I probably don't have enough time in this video to get into it in detail, but the short of it is that we have two main brain functions. We've got our prefrontal cortex, which does active thinking work. It's very slow. And then we've got our animal brain, or our limbic brain. And that is probably what processes most of what we do in the world, because we just receive too much data to be able to actively absorb and consider every piece of it. So our brain starts building in shortcuts in order to make quicker decisions, but these decisions are not very well considered, and those shortcuts can be where we develop prejudices. So one such shortcut is the concept of in-groups and out-groups. So an in-group is who you identify with and who you consider safe. So it could be developmentally as humans, this arose because when we lived in small groups that hardly ever saw other human beings, we had to know who was a hostile tribe and who was in our tribe. So our brains learned to differentiate faces on the basis of race and ethnicity much quicker than even we do so for gender, right? So that doesn't mean that we're primed to be racists, but we are primed to tell people who are different from us, and in order to ascertain who's dangerous or not. Now, that doesn't mean that your in-group has to be people of the same race as you. You can identify with an in-group of a different race if you think of them as your people, but your in-group can be your church group. It can be many, many things. But in South Africa, if you've been raised in apartheid South Africa, where you, for most of your life, probably if you're over the age of 35, your formative years and upwards, the vast majority of the population grew up in an abnormal society where people lived separately, and where you very rarely interacted with different races, and where you got messaging about the capabilities, and you had ingrained prejudices. So by and large in South Africa, your in-group does correlate to your race. And that's why it's sometimes so hard to have conversations with white liberals, for example, and even Indian liberals for that matter, because liberal politics teaches you to say, we don't see color, we hold top-line beliefs about equality, so we don't have prejudices. But you can't opt out of being a member of the human race. Your brain is primed to discriminate, and you live in a superstructure of a society that teaches you to discriminate with the primary factor of race. So I hate to break it to you, but you definitely have racial and other prejudices. So let's talk about the video. Let me break it down for you a little bit. So we see Lindsay interviewing members of different political parties, and back to back, she treats white men and black men markedly differently. So she'll interview John Steenhuisen or Fred, a front person, with their mask off. A black person steps up, removes their mask in a manner of norming to what is happening, and is then told to put their mask on. And you can see the confusion on their face where they're like, but why? But Lindsay clearly doesn't see an issue, and I'm fairly certain she was not aware of her discriminatory behavior until she watched the video, and was frankly as stunned as we are. And so what you effectively see is in-group affinity in practice. So she feels more comfortable around people who are in her racial in-group versus people who are out of it. And there's actually a number of studies that happened last year which show that our behavior around coronavirus compliance is lower. We take more risks around people of the same, that we perceive to be our in-groups, so people of the same race or ethnicity, and we are more afraid of, and we expect higher compliance, and we see more of a risk from people from our out-group, so in South Africa of a different race. And so when the ENCA and Lindsay say this was also a high stress situation, they haven't acknowledged the fact that there's racial prejudice at play. But scientifically, it's quite correct that your racial prejudices, which operate from that slow part of your brain, the fast part of your brain, the unconscious limbic brain, that as a child you learned behaviors and you learned ways of thinking of people in order to make quick decisions about your safety. It's quite true that your racial prejudices come out more when you're stressed and in situations of anxiety, like conducting an interview or being afraid of getting coronavirus, for example. So there is definitely science behind your racial prejudices operating more because you're less able to function out of that conscious part of your brain. It's also a really good example of who we're primed to learn who are authority figures and who we can talk down to. So I guess we need to talk about how those kinds of racial prejudices develop, right? Which we haven't done as yet. Your unconscious biases develop as young as the age of 3. And you can grow up in a completely liberal family who says, black people are equal to us despite what the government says. You can grow up in an activist family, but you still receive unconscious messaging from the society and people around you. So for example, who did your parents lock the doors for in traffic? When your mom's standing in a queue for the ATM, who is she relaxed around and allows you to run around? She's not holding on to her bag. Is it old white ladies? And if they're young black men in overalls, does she call you to her side? Does she hold on to her bag? You pick up those nonverbal cues. Like I said, you can't opt out of being a member of the human race or growing up in South Africa. So I'll give you an example from my own life. And I do this because I think it's very important to take the charge of owning the biases that you've grown up with. I spent the first 8 years of my life in an Indian township. And during that period, I didn't see a single black person who was a friend of my parent, an equal. Basically, I only saw people who were in positions of service. So domestic workers, gardeners, carpenters. And that you cannot, even if you grew up in a home like mine, which had liberal values, you cannot get away from the fact that you learned messaging about who's an authority figure, who do I respect? And as a child, you were allowed to give instructions to much older people, and they happened to be black. So you could see that potentially playing out in the video with Lindsay, where she feels very comfortable chastising effectively people of color, and maybe she doesn't feel quite so comfortable doing that with white men who in South Africa are viewed still as authority figures. So I'm obviously not in her head. I cannot say for sure that these are the prejudices she holds unless she's taken the steps to introspect and figure that out for herself. But it strongly correlates with the general messaging we get about who's an authority figure and who you can talk down to and who your in-groups are. It really, really is an excellent case study on camera of how unconscious bias operates. So what do I think the response should have been? I think that an opportunity has been missed to change that paradigm. You're not a bad person if you have racial biases, particularly in South Africa. You've picked these things up from before you were able to consciously think about what you'd like your values to be. You may grow up and have certain values, which are actually, your top line beliefs can be contrary to your underlying biases. So there are studies which show that black female HR directors can still discriminate and prefer white male candidates because society is telling them that's who authority figures are. So I would have liked to see Lindsay and the ENCA come out and say, firstly, we apologize. I watched that video and I realized that there's absolutely no excuse for the way that I've treated quite blatantly black members of parliament differently to white members of parliament. I may not have been aware of the fact that I have racial biases which affect my decision making and which have the effect of discriminating against people. I'm now aware of it and I am undertaking to introspect, learn about it, and change. So I know that may seem like a little bit of kumbaya stuff, but the question is, do we want to be angry, or do we want people to change their behavior so they treat us in a more equal manner, right? I'm not saying that race is not a valid response to racial incidents. Anger. Anger is 100% a valid response if you're a black South African and you're being gaslit consistently about incidents like this. So, I mean, if you think about it, I think we've all had the lived experience, as I said earlier, of saying, oh, that person treated me differently, and people will be like, no, they didn't mean it that way. I think you're misunderstanding, and here we have it on video where you can see it playing out in real time. So what I would love for us to be able to do is have a more nuanced conversation around race and prejudice, so that we're not in that cyclical thing of an incident happens, we get angry, we demand like heads roll. People deny it because they're afraid their heads are going to roll, and because of the way we view race as being a moral failing and an outlying behavior rather than something that we all have and all have to work on, then because they've denied it, you get gaslit again, which builds up that anger, and you're just again in this cycle. So I would like us to be able to acknowledge we live in an abnormal society. We're a product of an abnormal society. We've been influenced by that at a young age when we haven't necessarily chosen our values, and that has given us biases on a range of things like gender, race, age, ethnicity. But we need to acknowledge that. So acknowledge that and commit to addressing those. And I have to say, whilst anti-racism, the charge is always taken by people of color, racism is really, particularly in South Africa, it's a white issue. And as white people need to take the charge in addressing that and having the ability to step forward and say, I have racial biases and prejudices which affect the way I think. I may not have chosen them actively, but I'm now choosing actively to undo them and to make society more fair. So that's my viewpoint. I am going to drop my email address on the post, so if you want to get in touch, you're more welcome to do that. And I'm also going to share some links to some of the studies that I referred to in this video. Thanks. Bye.